Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar called the US Election Aftermath. My name is Professor Katharine Gelber, and I'm the head of the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. Before going any further, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous country on which we are meeting tonight, even though we're meeting virtually. I'm meeting on the unceded land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and our participants, I'm sure, are from a range of different areas of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of this land, pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also in particular acknowledge and welcome any Indigenous people who are in the audience this evening. So thank you very much for attending our webinar on the US election, surely one of the most momentous elections that we've seen in recent times in a democratic country, and one which, if you're anything like me, has been literally keeping you awake at night, wondering about the result. We have three eminent speakers this evening who are very well versed in all things electoral and election related, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Glenn Kefford, who's a lecturer in political science at the University of Queensland and a specialist in party and political campaigns. We also have Associate Professor Sarah Percy, who's the Director of the Graduate Centre in Governance and International Affairs in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. And we have Mr. Elliot Stein. Elliot is a graduate of the Masters in Governance and Public Policy program that we offer here at the University of Queensland, and he now works with government relations firm Britton, and he formerly worked at the Australian Consulate in New York for several years. Welcome to all our speakers, and thank you very much for coming. So we're going to launch straight into it. I am going to ask the speakers some questions initially, and we're going to open up relatively quickly to Q&A. So for those of you in the audience who would like to ask questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will be scrolling through those questions and trying to aggregate them into questions that we can ask the speakers. And we would like this to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to ask questions whenever you'd like, and I'll be keeping an eye on that Q&A function. But to get us started, I'm going to go first to Dr. Kefford. Glenn, can you start us off by talking about the nature of the campaign, the election campaign in the US? And please give us your thoughts on the nature of that campaign. What was significant about it? What potentially made a difference in that campaign? And did disinformation and some of those particular things that we've noticed about American politics play a big role in that campaign?
Yeah, sure. I think it's worth just at the start mentioning the dollar figure of what's been estimated was spent on the campaign. And the reports that we've got so far is that it was somewhere in the vicinity of $14 billion US, which is just staggering to think about the amount of money each of those campaigns have been spending, as well as the PACs and third-party groups. And that's it's an amazing figure, really. In terms of how the campaign played out, and I think if we talk about how the Democrats won and what their strategy was, the key for the Democrats really was to right what they perceived were the failures of the Clinton campaign in 2016. And a lot of the criticism from 2016 was that the Clinton campaign ignored the Midwest, and they ignored the big blue wall, those states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And I think that really was influential in directing the Democrat strategy this time around. It made Biden a really important and significant candidate because he had deep roots into those communities. And we look at the time that Biden spent in various states. The state where he spent the most amount of time was actually Pennsylvania. And I think that just makes sense about how significant they viewed Pennsylvania, but as well as those Midwest states. Clearly for the Democrats, the African-American vote is important, and we can talk about that a lot, especially in states like Georgia. In terms of the Republicans, there's a lot that we don't know yet. I think one interesting story is what's come out of Florida, and it seems to be significant. And what we've seen is that the Republicans were able to mobilize at least parts of the Latino community. And from a campaign standpoint, what really separated the two parties, especially from what we've heard so far in Florida was that the Democrats were pivoting away from the traditional get out the vote campaigns, door knocking. They were pivoting towards phone banking, peer-to-peer texting, and so on, while the Republicans were out on the doors. And clearly that's part of the broader story about how they understood and viewed the pandemic and whether it was important or not. The Republicans were happy to be out door knocking. The Democrats were worried about dying of coronavirus. Probably a pretty important point, but that's pretty significant that the Republicans were out doing that door knocking, doing that get out the vote work, because we know from the campaign literature that the best way to mobilize or persuade voters is a one-on-one conversation. So there's something significant there about what the Republicans were doing. To the disinformation factor, I think if we talk about Florida, what we're seeing is that there was significant disinformation and scare campaigns in the final week of the campaign, especially into those Spanish-speaking communities. So there's a question there about how effective that is, what it does. The literature tells us that it has an effect on increasing polarization, maybe demobilizing voters, but whether that actually convinced voters to change their vote, I think that's still an open question.
Thank you. We'll move now to Associate Professor Sarah Percy. Sarah, even though Joe Biden won the election, well, at least as far as the networks have declared it, it's also true that 70 million people still voted for President Trump. And in fact, 8 million more people voted for President Trump than in 2016. There was no blue wave that some of the pollsters had been predicting. Why do you think that is? Why did so many people feel comfortable voting for Donald Trump, and why did so many vote for him?
I think that's a really important question, because I actually think that for the American political body going forwards, figuring out the answer to this question is critical. I think it's too easy for external observers to just look at the situation and say, I'm baffled, I can't understand why anyone would vote for Trump, which is something that you commonly hear from international observers of American politics. But the fact is that 71 million people voted for him. And there was it was not by any stretch of the imagination a Biden landslide, although it's looking like a margin of about 3.5%. So I think we also don't want to downplay. The election feels very close because in certain states, because of the electoral college system, in certain states it was very close. But as an overall national vote, it's actually a reasonably significant margin. It's not wafer thin, it's not huge. But just coming back to that question of why so many people voted for Trump, I think there are a few things that played into this that people need to recognize. And the first thing I think for an Australian audience is just understanding the level of conservatism which exists within American politics. So it's often been said that the entire Australian political spectrum from left to right would fit comfortably inside the Democratic Party in the US. So when you think about that and you think about how that spectrum works in American politics, one of the things that I think for a lot of Americans is that they may in fact dislike Donald Trump intensely, but they dislike the Democrats more. And that overcoming that dislike, particularly in rural areas and particularly among religiously conservative voters, is been a major challenge for the Democrats. And perhaps one of the only ways that they can overcome that challenge is to more effectively mobilize their base vote, which of course is, for example, African-American and has been reasonably disenfranchised by various other quirks of the American political system. So one thing is conservatism. The other thing is, I think it's very interesting to see what the polling tells us about how the COVID issue finally broke down. We know that initial polling was saying something like only 2 in 10 voters in some key states cared about COVID as an issue. This seems kind of surprising, but one of the things when I talk to my undergraduates about American politics that I often point out is that this is a culture where freedom is everything, and being asked to wear a mask, being asked to go into lockdown is very challenging. My fun fact here is that it's been very difficult for the US to implement random roadside alcohol testing, breath testing, because that would be a violation of people's rights. And when you think about that, in that political context, getting people to wear a mask, that may actually annoy people and mobilize a particular base more than anything else. And I think finally, the issue of conservatism circles around to the issue of abortion. So we know that Trump loses among women extraordinarily, except for religiously conservative women. And the 2016 election, that was the category of women most likely to vote for Trump. And the reason why they were voting for Trump is because they wanted him to put 2 anti-abortion justices onto the Supreme Court. And he has delivered on that promise. So I think as that we get that more fine-grained data breakdown in the coming weeks, what we're very likely to see is where Trump does pick up votes among women and among white voters, it's often linked to that issue of religious conservatism. So these point to some really significant challenges for the American polity. I think it's too easy to dismiss this band of 71 million voters, in the words of Hillary Clinton, as a basket of deplorables. And I think if we go on doing that, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing for the country to rebuild and actually become less divided than it is.
Thank you, which brings us actually very nicely to the question I wanted to ask Elliot about, which is that populism and the type of political context that Trump rode the wave of, it wasn't created by him, and it's unlikely to end on the 21st of January 2021. What do you think the future is for this type of politics, for populism, or more specifically for the Trumpist version of populism?
Well, thanks, and it flows on really nicely from what Sarah was just talking about. I think when we're talking about Trumpism, it's a distinct and unique brand of populism. You can see its origins coming out of the global financial crisis, the Tea Party movement that rose up, and really the combination of opposition to healthcare reform in 2010 and economic crises coming out of that. You really saw a populist movement that kind of cannibalized and took over the Republican Party. What Trump was able to do was tap into that in the 15-16 period and really put his brand on it. Not unlike he's putting his brand on hotels and steaks and all sorts of other things. He's proved to be a better populist than he has been as a steak salesman. What he's now been able to do is create a movement really around him and centered on him and his brand and his family brand as well. So I suspect that although he'll stop being the president of the United States on the 20th of January, he won't stop being the leader of this 71, 72 million person strong movement. Now, not all of those voters, as Sarah spoke about, are attached to him specifically, but there are big chunks of the country within that who do associate themselves with his brand, and that's really tapping into that same Tea Party movement, and a lot of people who are find economic hardship and see him as a panacea, or at least offering a panacea that speaks to them. So I think what you'll see in terms of Trumpism over the next 4 years in particular, maintaining a really strong opposition and insurgency against a legitimacy in the Biden presidency. You've seen that already with a series of falsehoods being stated about the election result. They'll continue that. They'll try and have an impact in the 2022 midterm elections. Particularly, you'll see Trump, I think, playing a strong role in terms of endorsements and influence. And you've already seen going into the 2024 cycle, you've seen a number of people like Nikki Haley and others effectively being made to kiss the ring to try and get a Trump endorsement going to 2024, because they know that he will still have big sways of influence over big chunks of the Republican Party. The Rhino caucus, the Republican in name only caucus, is really the old moderate traditional Republicans. That's kind of all that's left there now. The rest is really Trump's party, and the question now is, what will he do with it? In terms of populism globally, we can get into this later on, but I think there's a big ripple effect of having 4 years of populism and an inward-looking approach, not least of which we've seen in Brazil and other places. And so I think the ripple effects of Trumpism we'll continue to see around the world as well.
And so I can't resist a quick follow-up. Do you think Trump will run again in 2024, or will it be one of his children? Or will he be indicted between now and then, which would make that a difficult run? And even if he is indicted, would it make it a difficult run? With someone like Trump, you can't rule out anything. You can't rule out Trump resigning the day before and making Mike Pence give him immunity for life. Goodness knows what he could do. I think regardless of what happens in 2024, Trump and Trumpism will be a big part of the story, and it'll be a big part of the Republican primary going into it, whether that means it's a
Trump family member or someone who tried to recreate the coalition that he has put together, I think we'll see a lot of that.
Thank you. We're starting to get some questions in the Q&A already, which is terrific. I'm just going to start with one of them. There is a question there. What does anyone on the panel think? Although I might direct it first to Sarah Percy, but anyone who wants to respond. What do you think are the implications of a Biden administration for US relations with China and Russia? Obviously, two global superpowers. There's an argument that Russia has played a very significant role in US politics in the last two presidential elections. And of course, President Trump has made a lot about his relationship with China. What do you think of the implications for those two important superpowers?
Look, I think that relations with Russia will be markedly different. I think that any Democratic president will have very little interest in becoming friendly with Vladimir Putin. And I think you will see a similar line, which is currently taken by European powers in terms of relationships with Putin. China is a different story. And I think the geostrategic nature of that relationship at the moment means it's never going to be a harmonious one. And you put that with an overlay of an increasing tendency towards authoritarianism within China. I think that it's a collision course for difficulty. That being said, one of the difficulties of the Trump foreign policy is its wild inconsistency. And I think that when you are trying to negotiate with a partner, inconsistency is terrible and diplomatically terrible. So I think that we might see at least some attempts for some more positive trade negotiations, for example. And I think a Democratic president like Biden will be less likely to be protectionist. But the fundamentals of the relationship are the fundamentals of the relationship. And that's going to mean geostrategic competition, and it's going to mean a degree of tension.
Elliot?
I agree with everything from Sarah. And I just add in sort of an unspoken or sort of looked at aspect of the last 4 years on the world stage has been the withdrawal of the US from multilateral institutions and organizations, particularly at the United Nations. And so, the UN is a big bureaucracy and a big series of committees and the rest of it. And what you've sort of seen is the traditional role that the US would play in leadership roles in those discussions and dialogues have been sort of withdrawn, and going into that breach of being people looking to change geopolitical norms and sort of baseline standards, and China and others have really capitalized off that. So I think the next 4 years has been about in that sort of in that strategic competitive tension as well, as the US tries to reassert itself, as I suspect it would under a Biden administration, into multilateral organizations and institutions. It's going to come up against some pretty strong headwinds from people who have had a free run for 4 years.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we're going to move on to a different one of the questions that's coming from our audience again, which is about the polling. The polling was wrong again. The polling was wrong in Brexit. The polling was wrong in 2016. The polling has been just increasingly wrong. So, Glenn, would you like to talk about why the polls got it wrong again?
Yeah, sure. I feel weird having to be the defender of polls here as a qualitative scholar, but I guess I sort of preface my remarks by saying that I still think polls are relevant and they can be useful and important. And I think a lot of the commentary about polls and errors comes from people who I'm not always convinced know all that much about statistics. There certainly are issues with polls, so I think we can sort of unpack that. But I think there's a communication problem, and then there's also an education problem. And on the communication side, I think one of the problems is that there's some over extrapolation which goes on from polls and assumptions made from what individuals or groups of polls say. The education side of things, I think, is problematic, especially when you get to the types of data, the types of analyses you get from 538 and Nate Silver, The Economist, the New York Times, where they've got modeling trying to predict outcomes and they're giving a probability. And there's a lot of assumptions made. So the 538 one this time around, I think it had Biden as 90% chance of winning. And there's always an issue here where if 538 says there's a 90% chance of winning, everyone goes, well, he's going to win. But the statistical analyses underpinning that are significant. And I think maybe organizations like 538, New York Times and others, maybe they could do a better job communicating some of the assumptions there. But I think the big issue with polling is not necessarily, well, I don't think it's bias at all. I think it's actually got to do with sampling, and that pollsters are struggling to create representative samples, whether that's a nationally representative sample, or even more problematic is getting representative samples from subpopulations, whether it's at the state level or, in Australia, it could be like the electorate level. And that's why we know that the more granular these polls are, the more problematic they often are, and there's a bigger margin of error. So I guess in terms of the sampling, an anecdote is that I've read previously that pollsters in the US, if they want a sample of 1,000, they might get 3 uptakes to do the poll per 1,000 requests that they send out. So it's hard to get people to participate in these types of surveys because a lot of it's online. And then there's also appears to be a weighting issue as well. So there's a lot of things to unpack there, and I think there are still issues with the polls, but I push back pretty hard on the idea that there's some grand conspiracy here, and I think it's got more to do with the mechanics of the way they try to build these samples and the struggles that they're facing. Yes, there's a communication problem, there's probably an education problem, and there's some over extrapolation which goes on, but I think it gets to the mechanics of the industry more than any sort of attempt to suppress votes or to any sort of conspiracy theory that we might sort of think of.
I think also in the US context, it's really hard to predict turnout and the difference between likely and registered voters. And then within that, trying to find a sample size which is representative. And I think a lot of the models assumed that a higher turnout was good for Biden, as opposed to, both teams rolled out really strong turnouts across the nation, as we've discussed. But I think some of the models really thought through what an increased turnout looked like if the Trump campaign was able to run up the board in some of those rural areas. And also, there's a big overlying aspect of COVID and what that did to voter, voters making decisions about whether or not to show up to the polls or not if they'd missed a window on postal votes. And there's the whole story about, voter suppression in that as well. And so trying to get a representative sample with all those externalities in the US system is diabolical. And we saw actually not dissimilar things in terms of polls predicting the Queensland state election at an electorate by electorate level, again, due to that sample size.
And I think one thing that's worth just chiming in with Glenn on a little bit is talking about those models and how they may have impacted voter behavior on the day. So there's been some interesting discussion for those of you who are frantically refreshing the New York Times website. You may have seen that they had a predictor needle on. And, the predictor needle was moving back and forth constantly, talking about what the likelihood of chances of victory were. And The Economist had something similar, and 538's run a bunch of models. And I think there probably needs to be some questions asked about how responsible that is, because it does actually drive people's behavior on the day. And, it probably not going to be able to put a lid on that sort of analysis completely, but particularly if you're getting it wrong at certain chunks of the day, you're sending the electorate unclear messages about what to do. And this is a new wrinkle in this type of big data analysis that I think people need to be aware of.
Yeah, and I would just add also that I think we need to push back on this idea that numbers or polling is objective truth. I mean, I just push back pretty hard on that. And, these models, it's not just about the quality of the data. Like these data analysts, the data scientists, they have agency in this process. Their assumptions that they're baking into these models are playing out in the way they produce their numbers. And we need to recognize this, that these data scientists, they have a significant role in what the outputs are.
So we've got, we've got a lot of really great questions coming in. One set of questions is about the Electoral College. So what role did the Electoral College play in either the polls being wrong and also in the result? There seems to be a sort of tendency, quite strong tendency now in the US, that you can win the popular vote but not win the presidency. And there are a number of crucial states that clearly play a very, very important role in who ends up getting the Electoral College votes. Are there any prospects for reform of the Electoral College process? Perhaps Sarah first.
Yeah, the Electoral College is really interesting. It's perhaps been less significant in this election than it was in the 2016 election, where you did have that disparity between the popular vote and the ultimate result, which was caused by, wafer-thin victories in states like Michigan, where Trump only won by about 10,000 votes, but yet carried all of the Electoral College votes of the state. The question of reform is a really interesting one. I mean, I think particularly coming from a context like Australia, where we're looking not just at proportional representation, but also compulsory voting, it looks very odd to use this as your system of choosing a president. And in fact, it was initially set up because the US is literally one of the first countries in the world to consider how you would elect one person to govern over you. And they did that in the context of getting rid of a monarchy. So what they were trying to do is create a system that was going to more fairly elect one person by making sure that rural voters and voters all over the country had an equal say. And of course, in practice, this has morphed into something which is really kind of untenable. So there's only 2 states that split their Electoral College votes. It's Nebraska and Maine, and everybody else, if you win the state, you get all those votes. One apparently simple solution might be to say, well, we should proportionately distribute the votes. So if Texas has 38 Electoral College votes and you've won a certain percentage of Texas, that's the number of Electoral College votes you get. The difficulty is not unlike changing the Australian Constitution. It's very hard to change the system. So it requires something like 4/5 majority in Congress and then a supermajority of states. So although the states all have to vote for it as well. And that kind of change, I think, will be very, very difficult to put through, particularly in a very divided electorate. I think if Biden had delivered an extremely thumping win, he might have had the authority to try and push it through. But even then, persuading people, and the Republicans have been the net beneficiary of quirks of the Electoral College over the past few elections as well. So they're very unlikely to want to change it. So yes, it leads to distorted results. There is no question. One of the things we haven't mentioned is that ad spend that Glenn was talking about in his opening remarks. If you live in Tennessee or Washington State, you probably saw approximately 0 of those ad dollars being sent, because there's literally no point in having a presidential campaign in that state because everybody knows where those Electoral College votes are going to go. So there's some great maps out there you can see of where the electoral spend actually occurs, and it occurs in all of those battleground states that we were all watching very closely over Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Thank you. So I'm not sure who would like to tackle this question, but I'll throw it to Elliot. So what happens if Trump continues to refuse to concede? What happens? This is sort of unprecedented. To me, I'm wondering, maybe this would be the biggest constitutional crisis since the Civil War, but maybe it would just be all a storm in a teacup. What's the legal process from here on?
I think it's somewhere between those 2 extremes. I think what we've all come to realize over the last 4 years is just how reliant a lot of the US system, and really systems around the world, are reliant on a series of norms and practices and standard behavior. We've also come to learn, I think, over the last 4 years that the ultimate check and balance within the US political system is a degree of shame. And if you don't feel any shame or any embarrassment, then there's not a lot of consequence. You can be impeached or exposed for a number of things, and if you don't particularly mind, then the show sort of rolls on. So to some extent, I think what we'll see is, Trump may or may not concede between now and January 20th. The Electoral College is going to meet in December. A new president will be inaugurated in January 20th. There is no compulsion or necessity within those legal mechanisms in the Constitution for the incumbent to be present at any of those activities. He doesn't need to come to the inauguration. He doesn't need to facilitate access to government. There are a series of laws on the statute books and ultimately governed by the Constitution, which will mean that the Electoral College electors will convene. And if my Bush lawyerism is correct, if there's a vacancy, which there is a vacancy on the 20th of January, and there's not a resolution with the elected person, that the presidency falls to the Speaker of the House, which is still Nancy Pelosi, and I can't imagine a lot of Republicans are going to be wanting to see that happen. So I suspect all the mechanisms will click into gear. It's going to be a really rocky 70 days, both from a bureaucratic point of view, from a transition of power point of view. I think the really big takeaway from this is that you'll see constant ongoing destabilization and erosion of legitimacy driven by Trump and his supporters. And so although there won't be a legal mechanism, there will definitely be a civil, social and political disruption.
Thank you. And sorry, go on, Sarah.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting too to see how other pillars of a democracy are playing a role in this transition. We tend to think of democracies as just being the institutions and the Constitution and the rules, but of course, two other bits of the democracy we don't talk about very often are the judiciary and the media. And in this case, both the judiciary and the media are playing very important supportive roles. So Trump may bring as many legal challenges as he likes, but if there's no case, he's not going to get anywhere. And there's been some quite stern throwing out of various Trump lawsuits already. And the other thing is that even the media has recognized, even the Murdoch media, particularly Fox News, which was sort of Trump's own station, has really been putting the pressure on for concession and transition. And today, again, they cut away from the White House press secretary when she was speaking and talking about electoral fraud. So we have to remember that those institutions exist outside the sort of bricks and mortar ones or the constitutional ones.
Yes, thank you. So we still don't know the result from the Senate race, of course, and there's actually going to be a runoff in Georgia as well, which may be pretty important in that. So it's quite possible that Biden won't control the Senate. Glenn, how difficult is that going to make it for Biden to fulfill his promises and to really deliver on some of the important areas in which he's tried to differentiate himself policy-wise, not necessarily from President Trump, from whom he's, poles apart, but from alternative democratic leaders and from President Obama. For example, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a very big issue around race relations in the United States, which is a weeping wound at the moment. It's a long way from being resolved. And there's a lot of hope, I guess, as we saw in the victory speeches by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, where they were talking, particularly Kamala Harris was talking a lot about Black women and about people of colour and their important role in American democracy. So how likely is it that Biden can deliver on those hopes, especially if he doesn't control the Senate?
Well, I think there's obviously some things he can do, and really what we've seen in the last few presidencies is a massive increase in the amount of executive orders being issued, but that only gets you so far. And I would think it would be very optimistic to assume that if the Republicans control the Senate, that Mitch McConnell is just going to roll over and start doing deals with the White House. I don't think that's likely for all sorts of reasons. So there's going to be serious challenges for the Biden administration, just like we saw with Obama. And I would expect it to be a similar sort of playing ground and a similar set of rules in place. What Biden can actually do on those, those deep and serious issues of racial injustice is going to be extremely challenging. And, part of the issue and part of the problem of having a federal system is that the federal government only has certain powers, and that eventually this has to go back to the states on a lot of issues. And how much are state legislatures controlled by the Republicans going to want to go along with Biden's plans on these issues? Of course, some might. You'd think that Democratic legislatures will want to go ahead if there's a big national plan here. But again, this goes to the the blood sport which is American politics, where everything is polarized on all sorts of issues, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's racial injustice, or whatever it may be. So yes, he's going to be extremely inhibited on what he can do on this front.
I think also if we actually look at what a lot of what Trump's done, he hasn't had a lot of legislative victories. In and of his own right. The majority of what Trump's been doing has been by various executive orders, despite what he and the Republicans have said during particularly the last 4 years of the Obama administration. So I think large part about what that first 100 days of the Biden administration is actually doing a lot of work to repeal a lot of both executive orders and administrative orders, including in aspects that will impact on race relations. And for example, there's a Trump executive order that suspended diversity training for federal employees and contractors. Like, he'll be able to rescind those sort of things by virtue of having control back of the federal government and bureaucracy. There's a range of things that Trump had been doing that Biden will be able to rescind off the bat. I think where the Senate really comes into play will be how much an obstructionist role do they play on senior appointments, and how much they try to really stymie the ability of Biden to take control of the federal government by virtue of stopping senior appointments across the board. On other things like climate, which is a top priority, Biden's already said he'll be rejoining the Paris Agreement on day one. So I think although the Senate will play an important role, particularly on budgetary matters and on appointments, the trend towards executive orders has been so strong that will actually have a really key part of the early days of the administration.
And so he's going to use executive orders, clearly. He's going to try and implement the policies around Black Lives Matter, around race relations, around climate change, where there's clearly a very important point of differentiation. And in fact, perhaps this is a really important moment globally for climate change policy and the ability of large polluters like the US and Australia to come to grips with that. But really the biggest task in a way is going to be to try and unite the country. So in the victory speech we saw, I'm going to govern for all Americans, whether you voted for me or you didn't. Sarah, what do you think his chances are of being able to do that? Or more interestingly, how do you unite a country that's so divided right now?
Look, I think if I could, I'm going to do the slightly cheating answer by saying if I could answer that really well, I have a different job. But I think that the first thing to note on that and on the steps going forward is, in a way, I worry a little bit that Biden will suffer a little bit from what Obama suffered from, which is there is a limit to what any president could do, even if they controlled Congress and the Senate, in order to fix some of these issues. These are very deep-seated issues. As Glenn has noted, this is not just a federal system, it's a federal system with 50 different states. So that's something else to remember about when people talk about Trump's impact on the COVID response. Look, I'm not going to say it was great, but I am going to say he did have to coordinate 50 different governors who had 50 different views on what was going to happen with the pandemic. So all of these things conspire against really making big inroads into those changes. And one of the problems I think Democrat presidents have faced is unrealistic expectations for what they're going to be able to do. And then an electorate that gets frustrated and angry when they're not able to do those things. But I think I think that the crucial task for the Democrat Party is going to be really having to break down what is going on with those Trump voters and which of those voters they're able to speak to. There will be some that they're never going to be able to persuade. There might be others that they might be. It might be also a matter of making sure that you're willing to make some compromises that you don't like. The other big question that lurks behind this is whether or not a more progressive brand of the Democratic Party would fare better electorally. So this would be AOC and the squad, pursuing a more Bernie Sanders line. And look, knowing what I know about American politics, I'm not convinced that that would work. I would like to think so in a lot of ways, but if you buy what I've just said about this being an extremely conservative society that thinks that Biden is a socialist and therefore is terrified of voting for him, you're going to have a serious problem if you're running further to the left of the platform, which is just one. So it's going to be a very, very difficult challenge. I think, though, one of the things that's worth pointing out is that if Trump had won, he would not have made a similar speech about wanting to govern for all Americans. And hopefully that in itself is enough of a first step that will at least begin to help things heal a bit.
I'm wondering if any of you has a view on slightly closer to home. We've talked about the potential relationship between the US and China and Russia under a Biden presidency. But what about the Asia Pacific region, ASEAN, the South China Sea dispute? What are relationships between the sort of Asia Pacific and Australia and the US likely to look like under a Biden presidency? Perhaps Elliot, you'd like to start?
Yeah, thanks. I think first and foremost, we're just going to see it will take time and it will take a lot of investment, but see a shift back to a more normative engagement in multilateral institutions, whether that's Asian, APEC, or other groupings here closer to home. So I think first and foremost, you'll just see a greater level of engagement in the world. Now, probably not unlike that first term of the Obama administration, where there were a lot of problems at home. Now, there were global problems, but there were problems at home, particularly in the economy. You're going to see that same focus from the US for a time being, between the immediacy of the COVID health impact, which can't go unstated, is just dire and diabolical within the US, and you can't have the economic response until you get that health response under control. So you'll see that as a first priority, followed by the economic recovery as part of that. Then over time, I think you'll see a greater level of engagement in the rest of the world. Obviously, we're yet to see a range of appointments, including I think we can probably expect to see a new ambassador to Australia from the US. And a range of senior appointments throughout the Foreign Service as well. Going the other direction from Australia to the US, I think, speaking candidly, that the Prime Minister has a lot of work to do. I think that the Prime Minister made a strategic decision last year to put a lot of eggs in the Trump basket. He spent 2 weeks visiting the US on a state visit. Now, it's an important thing to do if you're Prime Minister, to go and spend time with the current administration. And he got feted quite successfully in the US with Ambassador Hockey. But at no stage in those 2 weeks in the US did he meet with a single senior Democrat. And I worry about whether we have built institutional ties, both from the Prime Minister and at the DC Embassy, to make sure that we're ready to engage fully with a new administration when it clicks into gear in January 20th. So I think there's a lot of legwork to do on our side of the relationship as well.
Yeah, I take your point, and I think that it was definitely placing far too many eggs in one basket. But I think the nature of the alliance is what it is. And we tend to forget in Australia that part of the reason why the US wants the alliance is because the US does need a trusted partner in this region, and has that. The intelligence cooperation is extremely deep. The diplomatic cooperation at lower levels is extremely deep, because civil servants in both countries skew to the left. So they have a lot more in common with each other than they necessarily do with leadership. And the other thing is that bilateral relationships ride out personal dislike extremely well, and they have to. So, we didn't see, we've seen all sorts of situations where the relationship looks a bit fractured, but it comes right again. But certainly it's something that you would imagine you would want to focus on.
Oh, yeah, undoubtedly, like the fundamentals, whether it's at a military level, whether it's at a general cooperation level, are absolutely fundamental and strong, and both countries are strongly invested and committed to it. I just think there'll be take some time to rebuild those personal relationships which aren't currently there.
Perhaps we'll get a visit from President Biden. We didn't get one from President Trump. To go back to the voting patterns in the US, Glenn, one of the issues that some people find difficult to come to grips with is that a personality like Donald Trump, who's a billionaire, can present himself as a friend of the working class and the rural vote, and in fact gets a lot of votes from the working poor and from rural folk, even though he's a billionaire. So do you have any insight from your campaigning knowledge about how that works?
Well, I think just to talk more broadly about this, I think, if we go back to 2016 and then also we tack on Brexit, because they're always pushed together, there was this argument and this line that sort of was trotted out relentlessly. Oh, this was a working class revolt. And frankly, there's not a lot of evidence for that. I mean, what we saw in 2016 especially was that it was kind of a pretty traditional election in many ways. Over 90% of registered Republicans voted Republican, over 90% of registered Democrats voted Democrat. And, the early evidence we have now sort of has played out the same. In terms of like income bands, there's just no evidence to support the idea that the poor, those on the lowest income bands are supporting Trump. Like they're voting Democrat. Like the income bracket, which most highly supports Trump, is people over $100,000 income. So Trump and the Republicans are the party of the wealthy. That's 100% clear. Now, that doesn't take away for the fact that he has support in rural areas. Absolutely he does. And I think there's two things there. One is the party ID aspect, where voters are highly partisan and they're deeply polarized. And voters who are Republicans, lifelong Republicans, they're not swaying, right? The same as lifelong Democrats. So the party ID factor is important. There is also, I think, an argument you could make about social and economic dislocation, especially in, rural areas where, economies, the former manufacturing areas, maybe agricultural areas, the employment in those areas has dried up. Yes, this has potentially had an effect, and maybe this has played out along social and cultural lines. Maybe some of those voters have drifted towards Trump and his rhetoric in 16, and maybe he's held on to them. But I really push back hard on the idea that Trump is the party of the working class or the poor.
And what about the sick, Sarah? What about, 6 months ago, people were saying if we get more than 100,000 deaths in the US, that's it for the Trump administration. There are now 250,000 deaths, roughly. There are record numbers of cases every day. I think it's well over 100,000 a day now in terms of cases. I know it's hard to predict where it's going to go, but why didn't COVID play more of a role? Was it the rhetoric on the Republican side saying this isn't as dangerous as everyone says it is? Did that work? What's the role of COVID in the election?
So I think the first thing that I would like to say about COVID in the election is that I think that the Democratic Party should be very worried, because I think absent COVID, Trump would have won in a landslide. And I think the tightness of that election actually probably is due to COVID. And I think that, and mobilizing large numbers of voters on the Democrat side in particular. So I think that that's the first thing to note, is that I don't think Biden was a terribly strong candidate against Trump, and was probably given a push along by the COVID situation. I think part of the answer lies in what I've already said, and that for a lot of Americans, the restrictions are more problematic than the disease, particularly in areas which are not super urban. So where you see the most dramatic COVID impacts in situations like New York City, where you have a large number of people in a very densely populated place, and you have visible impact of COVID that you can see. Whereas if you're not in that scenario, it looks different. Now, again, Trump polls heavily successfully among rural voters, not urban voters. And if actually you can look at the map, the Electoral College map, where they take away the states, and you can see where all the cities are because they're all blue. So those urban voters are already voting Democrat. I think the impact of COVID going forward is going to be really difficult. Having run on a campaign that Trump was mishandling COVID, Biden again sets himself up some very high expectations among voters about what he might be able to do to bring the COVID situation under control. He's already released today a very long and very interesting statement about all of the things he intends to do immediately to try and bring the COVID situation back under control. But at the same time, you have scientists saying that the US has probably passed the point where any kind of track and trace system like we have in Australia is even possible because of the numbers of cases. So I think they're going to be hanging out for a vaccine. This is also a situation, maybe Glenn or Elliot wants to come in, where I think misinformation and disinformation has played a very significant role. You already have a big crowd of anti-vaccine campaigners going crazy that the Pfizer vaccine was announced today, saying, oh, it's a conspiracy. They had this information before. They waited until after the election to announce it to help Biden win. So it's all tied up together in a really interesting sort of cocktail of conspiracy theory and traditional political rhetoric.
I'll leave disinformation to Glenn because I know that I think he wanted to talk about that as well. But I think in large part, the challenge that Biden's got is a challenge that he set himself. The way that he won the Democratic primary was saying that he was the only person who could both reunite the country, but also be a Democrat who could talk particularly to outer suburban Midwest voters to reconnect with them, to bring them back into the Democratic fold. So although this is a big challenge and a tough challenge, he has built a career being that person and saying that he is a person for these times, and he's spent a campaign doing it as well. So I think it wasn't. I think COVID was a big part of it, but I think the reason Biden won, or the reason he was putting himself forward to win, was more than just COVID. It was about reuniting and reconnecting with outer suburban voters, and you saw that coming as early as the 2018 midterms, when the way that the Democrats regained control of the House was through winning outer suburban congressional districts in sort of what we now call the blue wall redux through the Midwest, and running on moderate issues such as healthcare. I think COVID sort of exacerbated that message about healthcare being really, really primary. And so the challenge ahead for Biden is the one that he set himself.
Yeah, on the disinformation aspect here, there's so much focus on disinformation online, and the obsession about targeted disinformation, and it's become the sort of the boogeyman of electoral politics, right? But I think what is much more damaging is disinformation spread by political elites. That's a far more damaging scenario when the president uses the office of the president to actually spread disinformation, especially on issues like health. I mean, okay, the election, what he said about the election is terrible, but on health, that's just staggering, because we know that when disinformation has its largest effect, it's from when citizens perceive it comes from an authoritative source. So the where the information comes from is really important. And of course, naturally, many citizens trust the office of the President of the United States, right? So if you talk about damage from disinformation, that coming from Trump and Twitter and from his office, that's far worse than, conspiracy theory groups and QAnon on Facebook making up nonsense.
I'm going to ask a wrap-up question in a minute, but just one final question before we get to the wrap-up, and that's to Glenn. What are the prospects of this type of politics happening in Australia? We've had some state elections or some ACT and Queensland elections recently with interesting results. There are certainly some people suggesting that some of the things that the federal government is doing and that other governments have done in Australia is an attempt at Trump light, perhaps. But on the other hand, in the recent Queensland election, we saw a repudiation of the One Nation vote, which halved. What's the prospect for this kind of politics happening in Australia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's, it's kind of a difficult question, because on one level, it's already here and it's been here for a long time. But then on another level, I don't think we're likely to get a Trump. And that's just got to do with the nature of the institutions, where US political parties are weakly institutionalized. Like US political parties, and frankly, the US political system is quite weird and a bit of an outlier if you compare it to other advanced democracies. So I think it's very unlikely that we'd see that type of figure anytime in the near future in Australia. Of course, we have figures like Clive Palmer, but Palmer is a bit like the $2 shop version of Trump. It's like it's hard to take Palmer seriously in contrast to someone like Trump. And clearly compulsory voting plays a role here as well, which I think is significant. It changes the debate from perhaps pulling parties to the margins. It pulls parties back towards the centre. And I think that's really significant in changing the types of people who emerge, as well as where parties generally head. There's a lot of criticism of parties in Australia, and one of the main ones is that they're too alike and they're too in the centre, right? And there's, I think that's a reasonable criticism. But would you trade that for the US system? And for me, the answer would be no. So I think that's pretty significant, and I think why we should be thankful for compulsory voting and the Australian Electoral Commission.
Yes, the Australian Electoral Commission. Thank goodness for them. I will ask a wrap-up question now. I'll go let all three of you make some final remarks because we're getting very close to the end of time. The next 70 days, they're going to be really important. We haven't had a chance to talk about the role of the Vice President, the historic fact that that is now a woman of colour. But if you're interested in that, the role of the independents in the election, Donald Trump still refusing to give a concession speech. So you can weave anything you like into the answer. But the next 70 days, what does that look like? Sarah?
But given that I confidently predicted Hillary Clinton would win the 2016 election, I'm slightly nervous about confidently predicting the next 70 days, but I will have a go. So I think that we are definitely going to see any hope that we would see senior Republicans really pushing Trump to concede seems to be evaporating, which I think is a bit of a concern. We have the former senior Republicans like George W. Bush who are doing that, but not people like Mitch McConnell. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. It's going to be interesting to see what the response is to failed legal challenges, and it's going to be interesting to see what angry Trump voters do as time goes on. So I think that it is still. We're not out of the woods yet in terms of seeing whether or not this gets a bit messier than it already has. I would hope that it doesn't. And then finally, just speaking about what's likely to happen in the next election, I think that's the other thing even beyond the next 70 days. So I think it's pretty likely that we wouldn't see Biden run for re-election. He's heavily hinted that he wouldn't do that because of his age. And so therefore, Kamala Harris was a very specific choice because of her age and the fact that she's a woman of color. So we would likely see a Harris campaign for the 2024 election. And whom she's running against, again, are we going to be seeing this weird dynastic turn in American politics, which we've seen over the last 20 years? Are we going to see more Trumps or the anointed ones of Trump? So, American politics is not going to cease to be extremely interesting. That's my best prediction for the next 70 days.
Elliot?
I think Sarah's dead right. So I agree with everything that Sarah said, and I'll add one US and one Australian. I think in the US, you're going to see Trump looking around trying to work out how to monetize his post-presidency, whether that's Trump TV, whether that is I don't know, back to the steak business. I'm unsure what, but he'll be looking for ways to monetize what he has built, and also turn that into a series of an ongoing populist movement as sort of a byproduct of trying to make money out of people. Back here at home, I think we've got a really interesting challenge ahead of us, as I alluded to before. It's worth remembering that at this stage in 2016, Malcolm Turnbull had already reached out and phoned Donald Trump to congratulate him, famously getting his phone number from Greg Norman, the golfer. We've seen no attempt from Morrison to do the same with President-elect Biden. I think that will need to be addressed sooner rather than later, and then hopefully buckling up for a return to normative values in January onwards.
And Glenn?
Well, I'll just give the social science answer here, that social scientists are always struggling to run experiments on the effects of disinformation. We now have a live 70 days to run panel studies on the effects of Donald Trump. So I'm expecting lots of panel studies of before and after of various Trump statements and the spread of disinformation. So good luck to social scientists around.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to draw it to a close now. We're out of time. I hope you've enjoyed this event. It's certainly been very interesting and stimulating. It's been a real pleasure to be able to showcase some of the expertise among the faculty in our school, in our Graduate Centre of Governance and International Affairs, which runs 3 master's programs, and in our alumni as represented by Elliot Stein. It's been a real pleasure. If you're interested in more, please don't hesitate to contact the school, check out our website or write to us and ask for more information. So now it just leaves I'm only left with the very pleasurable job of saying thank you very much to our 3 panellists for a really excellent evening and for some really fascinating insights. Thank you to the participants who put up the questions in Q&A. We couldn't address all of them, but we did our very best to address most of the ones, especially where they ran together. So thank you very much for attending. It was a pleasure having you with us this evening, and I hope to see you around the university and the school at some time in the future. Thank you, everyone.